welcome back to another episode of our podcast, Nothing in My Brain. I'm Joey.
And I'm Olivia.
And today in this episode, we're excited to welcome Dr. Alyson Abel, who's an associate professor in speech, hearing, and language science at San Diego State University and directs a language learning lab.
We're going to be discussing language impairments in children, the science behind it, her journey, and interesting research. Okay, great. So before we get started, do you mind introducing yourself a little bit? Like a little bit about your backgrounds?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Alyson Abel. I did my undergraduate degree in psychology and linguistics at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and did a clinical master's in speech and language pathology at Vanderbilt University, and then went right into a PhD program at the University of Kansas. It's an interdisciplinary PhD program in child language that crosses psychology, linguistics, speech, language, and hearing sciences and behavior sciences. So kind of putting together my entire background in psychology, linguistics, speech, language, and hearing. And then moved to the University of Texas at Dallas for 2 years, where I did a postdoctoral fellowship at the Collier Center for Speech, Language, and Hearing, a research fellowship there. And then I have been at San Diego State since 2014. Finishing year 11 at San Diego State University as an assistant professor, then associate professor in the School of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. So for our first question, we'd like to know what inspired you to specialize in the study of speech language pathology and work with children.
Yeah, so it's kind of a not straight line background. I first started doing research at Emory University in my undergraduate program. I was trying to figure out something else to do, and I had a friend who was doing research in a lab, and so I joined the lab as well, and we looked at how babies learn new words and whether babies can learn words if they're spoken by a teddy bear versus if they're spoken by a person. And I very quickly realized that while I like language learning research, I do not like research with babies. So quickly changed to preschoolers and over, which is my population that I work with now. And I like how kids learn new words, but I couldn't figure out how to make a career out of studying how kids learn new words and learn language. It didn't occur to me at the time that doing a PhD and having a research career was never really in my even range of things that I was considering doing. I had a mentor advise to look into speech language pathology because it kind of combined my interests. And so I took a year off after finishing my undergraduate degree. I took a gap year and worked as a nanny and looked into graduate programs and what that would look like. And so decided, sure, I'll try speech language pathology. But I knew that I wanted to stay involved in research. So even when I was applying to master's programs in clinical speech language pathology, I always knew that I wanted to be heavily involved in research, so I included that in my kind of search criteria for different universities, and ended up at Vanderbilt, where I had another mentor we continue to do research in how preschoolers learn new vocabulary. And she's really the one that helped propel me towards a PhD and making me think that that's what I should be doing. I love the field of clinical speech language pathology. The area that I study in kids' language, so different from speech sounds, which we feel a little more confident that we have good strategies on how to do intervention with kids' speech sounds. In the area of language, like vocabulary and grammar, we just don't know a lot about what to do to really get kids moving forward. And so I realized that despite my love of the clinical field, I probably wouldn't be satisfied practicing for very long. I probably would have too many questions. So that's what inspired me and support from a mentor inspired me to go on to get my PhD in child language, because I figured I might as well just go and try to answer the questions that I had.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was really interesting. I love how you're doing research to answer these unanswered questions. And so for our viewers, since you work a lot or you research a lot about language impairments, could you explain what a language disorder is and the different categories or maybe subtypes?
Sure. So I study developmental language disorder as my primary language disorder. So working within the framework of kids, we have what we would call primary language impairments or disorders and secondary language impairments and disorders. The secondary language impairments are easier for me to describe because they're more familiar to most people, and that's going to be a language impairment caused by something else. So it may be a child who has intellectual disability, in other diagnoses that because of cognitive differences, they or intellectual differences causes them to have difficulty learning language, and so their language is impaired. And I should probably also back up and say that when I'm talking about language, I'm talking usually about acquiring and using vocabulary, acquiring and using grammar, putting sentences together, asking questions, narrative stories, things like that. I'm not talking about making sounds themselves and understanding sounds. So we've got these kids who have trouble learning and using language because of something else. So we also find it in some children who are deaf and hard of hearing and learning spoken language, is that their spoken language may not be at the level of their typical hearing peers because of their access to language if they're exposed to spoken language and they can't quite hear it. So that's going to be a secondary language impairment. It's secondary to some other, another diagnosis or another cause. We also have primary language impairments, and primary language impairments are kids who have a language impairment, but there's no identifiable cause for it. They didn't have brain injury, no intellectual disability, cognitive differences, etc. And we, in the field, we call this developmental language disorder. And the developmental part means that it happens early in life, that it's developmental in nature. Obviously language, and then disorder meaning it's below their peers. And this is a really interesting disorder because it affects about 7 to 12% of the population. So that's 7 to 12 percentage of, or 12 to 7 to 12% of kids, and which is about 1 to 2 kids in every classroom, which is way more prevalent than autism. But nobody ever talks about developmental language disorder. So that's something that we're trying to do, is to get people to talk about it and get it more well known so we can support these children and families to the best of our ability. So again, this is a primary language impairment. There's not something else that has caused it. And these kids with developmental language disorder grow up to be adults with a developmental language disorder. It's not something that is fixed and they're able to go on and no longer have difficulties language. It's pervasive throughout the lifespan.
Oh, okay. So kind of as a follow-up, I was wondering that what causes these developmental language disorders because they have no identifiable cause.
Yeah, so we have some very preliminary evidence that there are it seems to be heritable. And so what you do tend to find is that for children, if you identify a child with developmental language disorder, chances are they have another family member or a parent who has also had language or reading-based language difficulties. And so there is heritability. And because of that, people who do really cool genetic research have started to identify genes associated with developmental language disorder. We also have a very small group of people, but people who are doing neuroscience related to developmental language disorder. And so there's a handful of people, really not very many, who look at neural structure. So using MRI or fMRI to look at whether there are structural differences in kids with developmental language disorder. And then people, including myself, who do neurophysiological research. So using EEG to look at electroencephalography to look at whether the brain processing is different in kids with developmental language disorder. And so we are showing neural differences in kids with developmental language disorder, but it's hard to know. It's kind of like a chicken or the egg problem. It's hard to know whether the neural structure and function is different that caused the developmental language disorder, or the neural structure and function is different because the developmental language disorder resulted in a different neural development over time. So that part we don't know yet. We know there are differences, but we're not sure where what caused the differences or whether the neural differences caused the symptoms that we see.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
So speaking about like working with like children, so how do like what kinds of like support or interventions are like most effective in helping children struggling with these impairments?
So there's a lot of interesting things that people do with kids with language disorders as clinical speech pathologists. And really, what we do is we take a very individual approach to intervention with kids. Because while we know we have kids with developmental language disorder with nothing else that causes it, they tend to fly under the radar and maybe not receive intervention services unless it's either very severe or they have multiple diagnoses. Also, what we see is that it tends to shift during the school years to a specific learning disability diagnosis as far as schools go, which is an entirely different set of professionals than when you're getting a intervention for a speech or language impairment. So one of my favorite lines of therapy or intervention services done by researchers out of England is called shape coding. And it basically uses shapes and colors to teach kids about how the different parts of grammar work. And so you would put like a diamond around nouns and a circle around verbs, blue and yellow for different parts of speech. And by doing so, it gives kids a really visually clear breakdown of the different parts of speech and guidance on how to then manipulate parts of speech to make grammatical sentences. So in English, for instance, when we make questions, we have to move something from later in the sentence to the beginning. So if you say like the dog is sleeping, to say is the dog sleeping, you take is and you move it to the front of the sentence.
Oh, yeah,
So
that's
for kids, so for kids who are having trouble making questions, by circling is and showing, with visuals how it moves can be really helpful for kids to make that connection. Like you're not making something totally new when you're making a question. You're just moving around the words a little bit. So but that's really only successful for kids who have that metacognitive ability to do that work and then use it in their speech and language, in their own language. But um, it has definitely been shown to work. And for more complex grammar, I find it's one of my favorite therapies to teach my students who are future speech language pathologists how to use.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's really interesting. And kind of in that vein, how can educators, parents, or peers support someone or support children that are struggling with these language disorders?
Great question. So I think that there's three questions in there because I would give different advice to educators, parents, and peers. For the most complex would be for our educators. I think that for parents and peers, one thing that we've seen as a shift in the field over the years is the use of diagnoses and labels. And that's just a shift in, I would say, society, is whether people like and choose diagnoses and labels. I feel like there is an advantage to using the label and diagnosis of developmental language disorder because it is easier to say to someone, can you repeat yourself? I have a developmental language disorder. It makes it hard for me to understand you, than just, I have trouble understanding what you're saying. Like that is harder to kind of put your finger on why you have trouble understanding what someone is saying. And if someone just said, I have trouble understanding what you're saying, I may just speak slower or louder. But the reality is that's not the problem for our kids or individuals with developmental language disorder. They may need more repetition, simplified language, other ways of support. So for educators, it may be giving a lot of visual support in addition to and to bolster the linguistic support. So I think that the diagnosis and the label helps, and it helps kids and it helps families identify and be able to advocate for themselves and for their children, and find a network and a community, which is really important. Like I said, repetition can be very useful, simplifying language, not giving multiple instructions at once. So this could go for educators and parents rather than saying, sit down, get out your books, flip to page 16 and start reading. That's four
Yeah.
sentences back to back to back to back. Stopping, breaking it down, maybe having it written. Sit down, get out your books, go to page 16, start reading. Have them written down. Make sure that you're giving additional support because for our kids with language disorder, it's going to be hard to kind of retain all of that, parse it out, and then do what you're asked.
Mhm.
I had a really good thing in mind that I was going to say as a strategy, and then I totally forgot what it was.
Oh yeah, the thing you brought up about like the labels was really interesting. How like they can be used like negatively, but they can also be like positive in clarifying like, oh, you do have this, and so they can get the support that they need.
And I've seen that in people who are deaf and hard of hearing, who, well, so for instance, my mother lost her hearing older, and I've seen her go up to people and say, I don't hear well. And she gets a very different reaction and response when she says, I'm mostly deaf.
Oh,
And so sometimes that label can really communicate information that I don't hear well isn't going to get you, if that makes sense.
mm,
Plus the community and the ownership. I think, again, in this day and age, with all the increased awareness and increased support of neurodivergent populations, I think this is the time for people to embrace their neurodivergence. And I would put developmental language disorder in that camp as well, right?
oh.
Embrace it and own it, and then hopefully that will help people advocate.
So how can peers maybe support like people, children with learning disorders?
That's a great question. I think that one thing is to, oh, I remember the other thing I was going to say about educators. I can come back to that, but it's a good one.
Uh,
I think for peers, it's a similar vein. I mean, if you think about a conversation, let's say you're sitting around at lunch and you're having a conversation, it's just language flying, right? And it's
right.
language flying quickly. And maybe there's people interrupting each other, and that's going to be hard for kids with language impairment to track, to parse, and to follow, and then to be able to participate. Because sometimes some of our kids with individuals with language impairment, what we find is that it's harder to generate your own language in a coherent way quickly. It may just take more time for me to, someone who's language impaired, to get out a sentence, because finding the words and then stringing them together in a grammatically appropriate way is just going to take more time because it doesn't come as fluidly. So making that space and being patient. So if someone that you know with language impairment is speaking, and then just giving them time to finish what it is that they want to say, maybe trying to decrease talking over one another. Um, it's hard to say to decrease the complexity of the language you use, because realistically in conversation, we tend to not use super complex
Yeah.
language. It's a lot of really short sentences. In classrooms, we use a lot of complex language, but not in day-to-day conversation. So I think just making sure that there's support, and maybe even repeating. So if you can tell that a friend is getting left behind and not being able to keep up with the conversation, maybe making a pause either for the whole group or stepping aside and kind of filling that the friend in so they're not feeling excluded.
Oh yeah, that was really good advice.
Did you want to like come back to like what you said about
Oh
the
yeah, I think that this is people seem to think that language learning and complex language only happens in language arts class. But in fact, and I've had this conversation with people in the math fields, either math tutoring or math educators. Well, they'll say, well, like, well, I know your kid has language difficulty, but I teach math. And so first I want to say, well, what do you use to teach math?
Yeah, language.
You use language. So like you can't, you're still giving instruction. And then the other thing is, there's nothing more complex than a word problem, if you ask me.
That
I
is,
mean, you've got like, Joe has 14 apples and he gives 8 apples to Tom, and then Tom only wants the green apples, so he gives 2 of the apples to Suzanne, who has 1 apple left. Like that's complex. There's a lot of information going on.
Mhm.
And so we'll hear, well, so and so used to only struggle with language, but now they struggle with math. So I think it's a broader learning disability. And I would say, do they struggle with the concepts of math, or do they struggle with the language of instruction of math, which is language, academic language, and the fact that math has now become language? And it's the same thing for science, right? When you read a lot of your new vocabulary in your science classes, you're learning new words, exposed to new words constantly. And you may have a definition to go to, but if not, you have to use all the other things you know to figure out what that new word you're learning means. And if you don't have the language to support that, then you're going to have trouble learning what that new word means.
Oh,
So it's language is so embedded in everything that we do, that especially as you get older in school, that it becomes really hard to say this is a widespread learning difficulty versus this is a language learning difficulty that you just can't separate from any other content area.
Oh, so is it kind of hard to separate like a language disorder from a learning disability, or are they kind of both the same thing?
Many of us in this, my field would say that they are different, and that you have kids with both,
Yeah.
language and generalized learning disabilities, but you have kids with just language disability disorders who have trouble with broad learning because they don't have access to language to use to learn.
Okay.
But if you actually were able to give them the concepts, they would be totally fine and able to learn the concepts. They just can't because the concepts are taught using language and
Oh,
tested using language.
yeah.
Okay, so like shifting more towards you and your research. So could you maybe like briefly explain like what your research is about and like what has been like most interesting to you in your experience?
Yeah. So what I've done over time is added on different bits of information and tools to the research that I do. So my primary research does what I call a combined behavioral and neurophysiological approach to study language, particularly words and vocabulary processing in kids and adults. For the combined behavioral and neurophysiology approach, like I said in the beginning, I use EEG, which collects electrical activity off the brain as kids and adults do a task, and then you can time lock changes in the electrical activity to a specific stimulus to say, like, is the brain doing something differently when a certain word, for instance,
Oh,
is happening. And I combine that with behavior because ultimately I was trained as a behavioral scientist. I care about behavior. What do people do? It's to me, the brain is interesting as a mechanism for why people do what they do. And there's always a joke because I do have colleagues who use what people do to tell us about the brain, and I do the opposite. I use the brain to tell us why people do the things we do.
mm,
So I always, when I collect information from the brain, I'm also collecting behavioral information. What are pictures that kids select? What are words that they produced? What are they doing, and how does that differ across different populations? So we have been doing a lot of word learning research where we introduce kids, school age kids, ages 8 to 16, to new vocabulary in controlled settings. And we look at how the brain responds as they're in the process of learning a new vocabulary word compared to, exposure to words where they're not learning. And what I want to know is, do we see changes in neural effort related to meaning processing as kids are learning a new vocabulary word? Do we see it become less effortful over time?
mm,
And do we see that that is the same as adults, or are there differences and or are there differences between kids with typical language development and kids with developmental language disorder? Um, One of the other elements that we do is we look at confidence, and this is getting to the second part of your question, which what I think is the most interesting. And so confidence in the right answer. So if I ask you, what is this word? And they give me, does this word have meaning? And they say yes or no. And they give me an answer. And then I say, well, how sure are you that's the right answer? Low, medium, or high? So that would be like a confidence question.
mm,
And one of the coolest things that I think we found with a former PhD student and a former master's student is that kids with developmental language disorder tend to be as sure as their kids with typical language peers, same age, that they're giving you the right answer, but they're wrong way more.
oh,
So they're giving me the wrong answer. If I say, does this word have a meaning, yes or no? They say yes. What does it mean? And they give me an answer. They're wrong more often, but they're also very sure that that's the right answer, just like their typical peers who are getting the answer right.
mm,
And then, interestingly, if you look at the brain, their EEG shows similar processing to the words, even when they're getting them wrong, also. So it's almost like their confidence is mirrored more in their neural processes than the accuracy of their answer. And that makes sense. It wasn't what I predicted would happen, but it
mm,
makes sense. I mean, they think they're right. So their neural response is showing, looks like they're right, even if they're wrong, because they have no
yeah.
evidence that they're wrong. We've never told them that they're wrong. They don't know that they're wrong. They think they're right. And so their brain processes reflect more how sure they are that that's the right answer than the fact that it's actually the wrong answer.
Oh,
Um, which, if we think about it, is kind of setting them up not to be successful Because if you learn a word wrong, but you're really sure it's wrong and your brain is processing, but I'm sorry, if you learn a meaning of a word incorrectly, but you're sure you got the correct meaning and your
Mm.
brain is processing it like you got it right, it's going to be really hard to overcome that and actually learn the right one.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. So is kind of like part of intervention for these language disorders, changing like the way we process the words?
Well, we may have to. So this is all pretty early and it takes a long time for the basic science that I do to get to intervention work. But I think that especially when we're talking about older kids, I mean, that work, like I said, is done with 8 to 16-year-olds.
Mhm.
Um, I think one of the things may need to be that it needs to be explicit. So going back to that shape coding grammar intervention that I talked about, where drawing pictures and using colors, making it really explicit and really clear how to do it, maybe what is needed for older children with developmental language disorders. Because assuming that with enough exposure, with some tips, they'll be able to process language and learn it similar to their language, typical language peers, just doesn't seem to be doing the trick.
So I know you mentioned that these language disorders are caused a lot by genetics, but since you also study children from low socioeconomic status, I was wondering if environment does play an influence.
So environment does not play an influence in language disorder.
Mhm.
So we know that for kids with developmental, for any kind of language disorder, there's not a clear socioeconomic status factor or influence. Um, and especially if you look at the effects of socioeconomic status on the areas of language that are less constrained by input, like grammar. So if we think about vocabulary and grammar, grammar being how do we put words together to make sentences, how do we use past tense ed to say that we're talking about the past tense, etc. In vocabulary, just do we have words? What we know from many years of scientists that have come before me and are doing the work right now is that the input that kids hear, so I'm going to talk only about spoken language input right now. The input that kids hear is by and large enough for grammar development. And there's a lot of reasons for this, and that would be a whole another many hours. I teach full classes on it,
Okay.
why we think that is. But um, kids can learn grammar with the input that they hear in their environment, right? And it's a rule. It's a rule-based system. So once you get the rules down, it's actually fairly straightforward to learn grammar. But vocabulary, if you're not exposed to a word, you're never going to learn it.
Yeah.
And so that's very different from grammar. It's not like I have to expose a child to every single grammatical structure sentence in the world. Um, but in vocabulary, you do. So what we do find is that for socioeconomic status is more likely to affect vocabulary insofar as it depends on what kids are exposed to, if they're exposed to certain vocabulary words, but it isn't going to affect grammar, which I would say is the backbone for language.
Oh, okay. So I think like so we were also wondering, kind of like pivoting from that, how do you think language learning shapes like a child's experience?
Oh, that's a great question. You really want me to do like whole semester long answers. Um, there's a lot of really interesting science on the relationship between language and experience. So there are people, who will say that certain cultures who have only a few color words only don't see the same or experience, not see, they experience the same range of colors as cultures who have more color words because you can't really, because you can't, it's hard to separate language and experience. Um, I've never done any work on that specifically,
Mhm.
but I think that that's uh, I've had these discussions with people,
Oh,
particularly
okay.
students, and I think that having the language to attach to a concept or an experience shapes that experience in a way that if you don't have the language to attach to it. So this is, we talk about this a lot in kids. Do kids experience things that they don't have language for? I mean, they experience them, but if they don't have a word for it or words for it, does it register with them that it is an experience? I think that's a really open question. As a language person, I would say you need language to really shape your experiences, but I think there are some cognitive psychologists who may disagree with me.
Yeah, I just think learning definitely like shapes your perception of things because like for example, like when I speak in different languages, that shapes like my perception of things as well.
Oh, and definitely multilingual because languages package information differently.
Yeah.
Differently, I do think it also shapes the way that people perceive their world if they're exposed to multiple languages.
Definitely.
Okay, so for one of our last questions, so how do you think that advancing technology has like shaped your field of research?
Um, Advancing technology has, if you take the subset of work that I do looking at the brain, it has made it accessible. Where, it used to be that people could do MRI research and look at the structure of the brain. It's extremely expensive, and you're not going to be able to get everybody to do it.
Yeah.
EEG gives us more flexibility to do look at brain function, and it's a lot cheaper. So that also makes it easier for us to be able to do that research, but also advancing insofar as you now have portable EEG systems. So feasibly, I could go with someone as they're walking around and looking at things, and as they're talking about things and kind of map on their language to what they're experiencing in real time. I've never done that, but I know that you can. And so it's becoming more affordable, and it's becoming more versatile, which allows us to use this technology with populations we've not been able to before.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, so I'm so sorry, but
You're
we have
fine.
to like evacuate from the room because the people are coming in after us. So, but it was so nice talking to you, and I think you're really well spoken, and you gave us some really interesting insights about like learning language disorders because I honestly didn't know much about it going in.
It's so cool. It's the coolest. So
Yeah.
thank you so much. I'm always happy to talk about it.
Okay, yeah. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for taking the time,
Absolutely.
and we hope you have a nice rest of your week.
Yeah.
Thank you. You too.
Okay, thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye.